am Mango Thunderslice, and today's video is BLU, examining the COVID cult, mask mania, and progressive psychosis. Subtitle, Moral Inversion, Psychological Manipulation, or however much of that will fit inside the 100 characters of the title limit. And yeah, basically this is a video kind of, not last weekend, but the weekend before last. Space Panther and I and the Beans went on a little just kind of weekend trip to San Francisco, just because, you know, the prices of hotels were dirt cheap because nobody's really doing anything or traveling, and I don't know, we just kind of wanted to go somewhere that wasn't too far. And, you know, both of us were born in the Bay Area. It holds kind of like a sentimental value to us. As much as that city has fallen, you know, there's a lot of aspects about it. If you just separated the psychosis, there are a lot of aspects of the city that is beautiful. You know, there's Golden Gate Park and just a lot of the different aspects of the coastline there. And it didn't always used to be so crazy, you know. And even being a liberal 30 years ago is a far cry from what, you know, people who are calling themselves liberals are today, you know. Back when the city was more about finance than tech. Tech hadn't really happened in the big way yet. And, you know, it's, of course, has the legacy of the LSD phenomenon and, you know, lots of different cultural aspects. But everything's kind of been subsumed and co-opted into this great cultural Marxist program now. And it's just wild to see it, you know, up close and personal. And, you know, it's just very interesting. Like, even the liberals and the Democrats out here in El Dorado County of California, one of the red counties, they're not like complete Marxists. They're just kind of like, you know, they believe in more of the program than the people who don't self-ascribe those terms. But out there in San Francisco, it's really every single person not only wears masks indoors, wears masks everywhere. Every single person wears masks outdoors, usually 2 masks also. We saw a ton of double masking. People wear them in their cars. They never take them off. They probably sleep with their masks on. They probably shower with their masks on. And it's just amazing. Like, you know, we walked around the city and, you know, I can count of the thousands of people we probably passed in the course of spending the day walking around the city. I probably saw less than 20 people who were not wearing a mask, and it was almost like, you know, you smile to each other and you nod and you acknowledge each other, you know, on the path, because people, they were visibly discomforted by the fact that we were not wearing masks. Again, all outdoors. You know, when we go indoors, we just, as much as I'd love to ruffle feathers, I usually, you know, when we're otherwise wants to buy groceries or, you know, get something from a food place, I'll wear the mask, you know, usually with it under my nose, just to signify that I'm not going to fully comply. I'll comply insofar as to get my food and get out of the building, but I'm not going to fully comply. And you know, it's just amazing. Like, people, when you approach them and they're coming by, some of them might even have their mask lowered, but then when they're passing you, they'd pull it up over their nose and over their face. Some people had just had it already on and they'd tighten it over their nose. Again, it's like, even the premise of the mask is that it's not to protect you, it's to protect others from your exhalations and your, you know, spit particles and, you know, whatever coming out of your face. So it's just hilarious, again, that people think that, like, this mask is like this shield, right? Even in the conventional narrative, it is not there to protect you. The whole idea is that we're all protecting each other and, you know, all that nonsense, even though that's not really even scientifically verified. And if you look at the macro data, it doesn't actually do anything to affect the longer and larger terms, you know, trends in cases, hospitalizations, and deaths whatsoever. Right, Florida is really not fundamentally much different than California with regard to the virus statistics, and Florida has, of course, a much different attitude towards this whole thing. And it's funny because, again, the people who I know who all basically have gotten COVID are people who wear their masks all the time. So it's not really, again, anything. You could do so much more for yourself by just nutrifying your body and training your real God-given immune system than trying to hijack it with all these little fixes, these little synthetic fixes, whether it be the masks or the vaccines, right? Give me the freaking virus. Again, my immune system will snap its neck, dissect its entire genome and basically completely immunize itself through its own natural processes in a matter of hours, right? I mean, who knows? I may have already even had the virus and had no symptoms whatsoever. I never would have known. I'm not going to just go get a test just to find out. Even so, the test is not even an accurate diagnostic. The inventor of the polymerase chain reaction, aka PCR test, has even stated that it was never designed to be a diagnostic test. It's usually for, genetic sampling to determine if something is in, to identify a genetic sequence within a sample or substance, but it's not supposed to be a diagnostic. And it basically takes a little bit of genetic material and replicates it over and over again. That's the cycle threshold. And so when you run the cycles high enough, you can basically turn anything into anything, because the more cycles you run through, like anything in this universe, things mutate a little bit, they change. So you run, the chain reaction for many, many cycles, and, it can show things that aren't actually there, because it's changing a little bit with each iteration of the cycle. And, it's just really wild. Again, we walked around for the whole day, and it was a good long walk, physically exhausting also because, the Barons were not so keen on being in the stroller for long periods of time, but it was psychologically more taxing than anything to just pass by that many completely brainwashed people, just total and utter sheep that will believe anything and everything that the media tells them, with a religious fervor that I've never actually seen in religious people. They believe the media more than the Mormons believe the Mormon Church, more than the Catholics believe the Pope. It is really astounding the level of total and complete faith they have in the media narrative. And even people in New York, it doesn't appear that level of San Francisco psychosis, maybe in parts of Southern California too, but really it's the deepest of the deep programming in the San Francisco Bay Area. And of course that's where the lockdowns all started. It was there was the Bay Area that first was locked down, and then kind of the whole thing domino affected across the entire country. And again, the states and the localities that have not done lockdowns, there hasn't been any cataclysmic situation with cases or hospitalizations or anything. It's almost as if, like any other virus in history, it runs its course until herd immunity naturally is achieved, and then basically it's just an endemic thing, but the host population has a defense against it. It can identify it. And we are seeing this massive decline in cases now, and really the only explanation is natural immunity. The severe decline started before the vaccinations were really starting in large scale, in earnest. And really, again, we can try and hijack the system, but ultimately what God created is superior to anything that man created. And the best thing we can do is amplify and supplement and support that natural system of immunity. But, this video is it's triggered by that whole experience in San Francisco, but it's also just kind of a wider look at this whole mentality. What is it that causes people to be like this? How can people really get so deep into the program? Because for me, I've always been able to identify the program. There was a time when I called myself a liberal. I believed things that I don't currently believe. But still, I was able to see clearly enough that when the most ridiculous narratives were presented to me, I was able to kind of snap out of it. I remember even when I was a liberal, the idea of gun control was really part of the thing that snapped me out of it. Because there's one thing to be against guns in general because you feel that they're dangerous and you feel that they should be removed from society because you feel that they, only a thing like that can only hurt people, should not be around. But then again, they're not in favor of getting rid of all guns. They just want only the government to have guns. In other words, they want only the police to have guns. And I was very anti-police when I was young. I'm still not super pro-police, but I'm not anti-police like I was. I guess I've seen a little bit more of the actual criminal element of the world, and I've been robbed and had things stolen, and I've seen some crazy stuff and realized that it's not all just rainbows and gumdrops on the streets, and you kind of do need those immunity cells of the human organism to be out there and controlling, the variables that otherwise aren't going to be persuaded away. There's only so much you can persuade with a tweaker, right? With a junkie. And, people, there is danger in society. There are truly insane and criminal elements. But it was the idea that you want only the government to have guns. That is the stupidest idea I've ever heard in my life. And there's really no way to get rid of all the guns. Basically, they really are advocating for a totalitarian state where only the government has the ability to use lethal force and no one can defend themselves. And again, completely anathema to the founding of this country, to the mentality of the vast majority of Americans. Even, over the last year, there have been more firearms purchases than ever before, right? Even before, higher than Obama's re-election and all these other scares where people thought gun control was coming. The level of background checks has been monolithic with all the cities and the Black Lives Matter riots and, just cities turning into just chaotic war zones over these mostly peaceful protests, so to speak. And, people are arming themselves in a big way. And so it's good. Again, gun control is never really going to happen. Even with the Democrat majority in Congress, again, they can only override resistance on a simple majority vote for budgetary things. Anything that's regulatory, they still need 60 votes in the Senate to change anything. And two of the Democrats, Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, already indicated they're not willing to, eliminate the filibuster, which would enable procedural changes to change with a simple majority. So a lot of the things that people are afraid of happening really aren't, going to happen. There's still a risk of the rhino Republicans of joining forces with them over some virtue signaling, but ultimately there's still a good amount of resistance to a lot of the worst case scenario things happening. And it's not about red versus blue. I think this whole election cycle has shown people in a big way that you can't count on one party, over the other. You can't count on the Republicans. Mitch McConnell is as much of a swamp creature as Nancy Pelosi. And it's just, we have to have a complete, reset, if you will, the greater reset in the whole political psychology of the country, especially among generations like mine and those that are coming up, to realize that this does need a whole axis shift of mentality, and that people need to examine the psychology behind it all if they're going to accurately respond to it, because just going conventional Republican is not at all an effective response. There's a reason, again, that people have fallen away from religion. It's because a lot of the religious forms that exist in the world and that have been propagated are fundamentally flawed. They do not adhere to the word of the Bible and the word of Christ. They basically twist it into their own sort of cult, and it pushes people away. If people were actually presented with the truth, they would not be repulsed by it, they would be attracted to it. And that's not to say, that, we need woke Christianity, we need to water it down. We just need to realize that nature is part of God's creation, and that any religion that casts nature aside as something satanic is not something that's really valid or coherent with the spiritual text in any shape or form. And so when things are brought back into their harmonic resonance as far as nature and the spiritual text, then I think we can cast a wider net, and we can attract people with the proper spiritual viewpoint, that everything is created by God, everything is connected, and that there is a purpose to everything, and that realistically it is in that power of self-reflection and forgiveness and transformation and transcendence that we can affect not just things within ourselves, but throughout the world. And that it's, again, it's a very powerful mentality to have when you realize that you are the singularity. And when you take control of that vortex, you can take control of all the other vortexes around and influence them. And this is kind of, again, the thing that the people who have fallen away have fundamentally, almost ubiquitously experienced some early age psychological and or physical trauma, and that caused their ego formation deform in some way. And so they don't really have a sense of self-esteem. They don't really have a proper, healthy ego formation. And so it's really all about this caring for the others, right? Everything in the BLU program is a manipulation of the natural human instinct to help and to care, right? But ultimately, supporting progressive policies doesn't actually help anyone. It doesn't actually mean you care for anyone, but it ties into that psychology that basically that people want to, right? You don't actually help people by, voting for welfare. You don't actually help the minorities by voting for reparations and subscribing to all this woke nonsense. But it makes people feel like they are helping. And so you really have to learn how to discern bullshit and not just be taken in by rosy words if you're going to resist the program. If somebody can con you into compliance by saying, oh, if you don't support this, you're a racist or a sexist or a bigot or a xenophobe, then you are psychologically weak and you are as easy as rice pudding to be molded into the shape that they are trying to shape you and fit you. You have to cultivate a strong mental attitude that actually is willing to be ridiculed and willing to go against the grain, because that's the other thing. Ridicule is a big part of how they control people. Oh, those silly anti-vaxxers, those silly climate deniers, those horrible racists. Basically anybody who doesn't support our preconceived cultish mentality is all these different things. And, they control the media, so they resonate this narrative and this opprobrium and this ridicule. And they make it seem like, anybody who questions it is just, basically a snaggletooth redneck, crazy, neo-Nazi who's just basically, a prime mentality is just, controlling other people and doing violence to them. And nothing could be farther from the truth. And again, they twist people so far that, they become the fascists that they think they're fighting. Nobody is more fascist than Antifa in a big sense. Nobody wants to control speech and do violence to their political opponents like the anti-fascists. And, it's really astounding. The best thing we can really do in the end is raise the next generation to be free of that psychological trauma, to be raised with that healthy ego formation and the proper spiritual instruction, to actually have that strong foundation, right? As Jesus said, the seed planted in the healthy soil, that when cultivated to maturity will propagate its own seed 1,000 times over. And, basically, even if most of the seed falls on sandy soil or underneath the vines, that one seed that grows to maturity that was grown in healthy soil will make up for all the other failures, will make up for everything that did not succeed. And the more that we can take an active role in that process, we can plant more and more of those seeds in that healthy soil. And we can raise our children to be just, basically angels in a world of chaos. Truly, I think that there's things we can do for people who are at maturity. You should never go chasing after people who are brainwashed and try and save people who don't have any interest in saving themselves. But sometimes you get those glimmers of light. You see people who, seem to be trying to pull themselves out, and you can always throw a life raft, right? But it also comes down to the environment that people in. Like in these cities, in these urban environments, they're so electromagnetically controlled and oppressed that their DNA is unraveling on a daily basis just from the pure aspect of all the interference patterns of Wi-Fi routers and radio towers and cell phone towers and electronic devices and the entire power grid that's all around them. All of these things are creating a destructive interference pattern for biological life caught within that matrix. And so, you go out to places where it is more rural, where there is more biological material than there is synthetic electronic material. And, people, again, in El Dorado County, even the liberals and the progressives aren't like they are in San Francisco. There's something about that crazy psychology and psychosis that only happens when you are completely inundated with electromagnetic fields. And I remember even being at a concert in San Francisco many, many years ago, and they had these huge towers set up. I mean, it looked like they were kind of cell phone towers, but They looked almost more like the weather manipulation towers, and everyone at that at that concert was just of the weirdest mentality I've ever experienced in my life. And again, it's all these hipsters in the first place. They're all hyper socially conscious, but it's when you put all of them together and they're subjected to that electromagnetic field, it's really astounding. Everyone seems like they're an alien. They seem like they're just a robot whose programming is going a little haywire, and they're trying to fit in with this crowd of humans. But you get an entire crowd of people who are all like that, and it's very uncomfortable for a person like I presume to be, who is basically more naturally attuned and trying to just relax and have a good time for the most part. But so you have to make yourself available to the creation. You have to put yourself in nature and make that connection. Put your bare feet on bare earth. Ground yourself electrically to the planet that, again, is the manifestation of creation. The earth and the moon and the sun, these are part of God's creation. And that, the astrological calendar is the calendar that God created. Nothing happens in a New York minute when it comes to the work of God. But there are time cycles. Time itself is just a measure of relative motion. And the ultimate motion that we have to measure ourselves by is the movement of the heavens and the planet. And, it's again, by deconstructing people's minds and causing the psychological trauma and separating everything, fracturing that mentality as a result of that trauma, which, again, the church has been instrumental in doing. I absolutely am a follower of the Word of Christ. But I think that in many cases, the Church of Rome and many other established churches are the seat of the Antichrist. I think that basically they are the representation of Satan's dominion over this planet. And that we need to call out all sides and every side that is peddling untruth and trying to continue that fracturing of the human mind. Because, again, that is the genesis of the progressive psychosis and this whole mentality that produces the COVID delusion and the mask mania. People would not be so willing to enslave themselves to show that they're helping their community. Again, I presume that the people who are wearing these masks, they're not doing it maliciously. They're doing it because they really think that is helping their community. They're doing it, again, in this hijacked sense of, I'm helping people. Regardless of whether or not it actually is, none of them are willing, even if they're dubious on the science, if they were able to think that far through, they're still going to wear it, double mask, triple mask, whatever they get told to do, because they don't want to be that person who goes against the grain and seems to be opposing the narrative. It's more important to follow the narrative even if there's not a basis to it. That's the mentality. The willingness to subject oneself and enslave oneself ultimately for the sake of appeasing the narrative and the social, collective. And that's just, I've never fallen into that. I've always been more of an individualist. I definitely enjoy having a social environment. I like having a collective environment in which to, interact. But I would never, ever sacrifice my individuality and my own sovereignty, for the sake of appeasing a narrative. And so as for those who've been listening to the video for some time, there's really not a mainstream narrative in the entire world that I haven't completely obliterated with pure logic and rationality. And intuition alone. I don't, even without the science in front of me, I can use logic to just obliterate all of the mainstream narratives. But none of these people actually seem to go that far in critical thinking. Critical thinking now makes you a domestic terrorist and a white supremacist and a climate denier and all these things. Even though their own model of the climate is based literally in a flat earth energy budget, it is the most candy-ass mono-dimensional simulacrum of the climate, and it is a complete and utter joke. The science behind the masks is a total and utter joke. The double masking study that the CDC put out is a plastic mannequin. It was not a human study. Even within the study, it says that these results should not be extrapolated to the real world scenario, and that there's it's like literally says in the study, this does not apply to actual people in the actual world. It just shows that our mannequin basically had some differential in airflow and particle throughput when we slapped 15 masks on it. It's just completely asinine. But and then there are people on the liberal program who esteem themselves to be very intelligent and scientific and literate, but ultimately they will always bend their mentality to the narrative. They will take the conclusion given, even if the studies that they're supposedly reading don't actually support what is actually being claimed and said. You know, things like the spraying of the sky, right? And a person who actually understands chemistry and atmospheric science will know that it's not a contrail. It's definitely not a contrail. It's an aerosol spraying. But because to assume that is what their eyes are telling them is true would imply that somebody is spraying the sky, and that the conventional narrative is that, oh, we're not spraying the sky from the government, etc. To believe what their eyes are telling them is to believe that A, the government is lying, and that B, that there is some nefarious intent potentially behind that deception. And they are so unwilling to believe those secondary conclusions that they disbelieve what their eyes are telling them. They will literally overrule their own senses and rationality, because then the conclusion of believing their own eyes would imply a conclusion that goes against the narrative. It's just really astounding. This really is like the Matrix. And so we have to, you know, for those who have ears to hear and eyes to see, it's important that we have that connection and, you know, basically, follow our own internal and external senses and you know, lead where it's going, because ultimately only with that kind of stability and grounding are we going to be able to deal with the real issues and problems as they materialize in front of us. So that's my video today. Talk to you guys again soon. Peace.
Ah.